Hi there, this is lecture number 3 on Latin America, the fall of empires and European colonization, and it corresponds to pages 453 to 469 of your textbook. All right, so we've already learned about how the Europeans conquered the early civilizations in Latin America using the conquistadors. We know that it was the Spanish and Portuguese who began colonization of the Americas during the age of old imperialism, which lasted from 15 to 1800 or thereabout. Soon, these colonies in the New World will result in a blending of Latin American, African, and European cultures. Before the arrival of the conquistadors, there was an age of European exploration. Using modern technology like compasses, caravel ships, and astrolabes, European explorers like Christopher Columbus searched for faster routes to Asia. Financing their missions overseas by monarchs or kings in Europe, explorers like Columbus were looking for riches. Columbus mistakenly thought he had landed in the East Indies, calling the native populations that he encountered there Indians. He actually landed in what we now call the Bahamas, but the word Indians for Native Americans unfortunately stuck for hundreds of years in student textbooks. Columbus's journey, however, also created tension between Spain and Portugal. In order to set some boundaries and ground rules for exploration and their competing claims, the Spanish and Portuguese signed an agreement called the Treaty of Tordesillas. This created a boundary called the Line of Demarcation. This was an 1,100-mile-long line extending from north to south. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain was allowed to claim all land west of the Line of Demarcation, and Portugal was allowed to claim all land east of this line. The line of demarcation actually crossed over the land in South America that is now called Brazil. What language do they speak in Brazil? Well, Portuguese. If you look at the map of colonial possessions, you'll notice that the west of Brazil, it appears that Spain has claimed all of that, whereas Brazil has claimed everything to the east, right? And Brazil was actually claimed by a Portuguese explorer named Pedro Cabral. I'm probably mispronouncing that, sorry. Yeah, well, that's why people speak Spanish in the parts of Latin America that were colonized by the Spanish, right, to the west of that line. And Spanish territory under the Treaty of Tordesillas was, everything to the west of the line. And then Portuguese is spoken to the east of that line. So just take a look at the map. All right, Columbus's encounter with the New World, as the Americas were called, will usher in the European age of exploration and eventual colonization of Latin America. The Treaty of Tordesillas helped to create sort of a free-for-all amongst explorers and adventure thrill-seekers who wanted to claim wealth in this new world. Other explorers included Vasco Núñez de Balboa, I just butchered that name, who was the first European to come into contact with the Pacific Ocean, which he initially called the South Sea, but then was later renamed by Magellan. There's actually a park in San Diego, California that bears his name today. It's actually a really cool park. Check it out. Another explorer was Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan and his crew are credited with having first circumnavigated the globe, although Magellan died in the Philippines and never actually completed the voyage. Magellan was the first European to cross the Pacific Ocean to get to the Spice Islands, or the East Indies, from a westward route. Although Spain and Portugal dominated the early age of exploration, also called the age of old imperialism, during the 15 and early 1600s, soon, other European nations will compete for power and influence as well. Great Britain, France, as well as the Netherlands will join in the race for territories around the globe, beginning in the 1600s for the most part. Spain had the most powerful empire, though, in the world by the 1500s, with territories spanning the globe. With such a large empire, the Spanish king divided the kingdom in half and appointed a leader called a viceroy to rule each side. A viceroy is a word that means a ruler who rules in place of a king. Under the viceroy leadership, the Spanish established an organized system to rule their territories and began building cities and towns throughout Latin America. Colonies had been set up for the sole purpose of making Spain rich. There's actually a term for this. It's called mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic system that is based on setting colonies up for a mother country around the globe. These colonies' sole purpose is to make the mother country as rich as possible. Colonies provided the mother country with raw materials and also served as a marketplace for finished products. Under mercantilism, colonies are dependent on their mother country, and they're not allowed to engage in their own trade without the mother country's permission. During the age of old imperialism, European countries will all engage in this type of economic structure. This was further indication of the imperialistic mantra of the time period, God, gold, and glory. Well, soon the Spanish will establish large plantations throughout their colonies. Former conquistador soldiers and officers were given large tracts of land called encomiendas. These encomienda land grants allowed for large plantations called haciendas to be set up for cash crop production. In much of Latin America, sugarcane was grown to make sugar. Under the encomienda system, landowners were allowed to do whatever they wanted on their land, including were able to enslave the native populations who were already living on the land. The result of this encomienda policy was the forced labor of native populations, or slavery. Slaves were forced to work in dangerous mines to get silver and gold for the Spanish. Native American slaves were forced to endure backbreaking labor on sugarcane plantations. In some areas, 4 out of 5 native people died due to slave life alone. Many people spoke out against the encomienda system on moral grounds, including a Dominican friar, or basically a priest, named Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas fought on behalf of the native populations. He inadvertently, however, opened the door to the African slave trade. Las Casas suggested that Europeans use labor from Africa instead of the Indians. And because it was soon apparent that the Native American populations were not acclimated to this type of work, the Spanish and Portuguese found a new source of labor: African slaves. African slaves were more accustomed to farm labor and were more resistant to the diseases that the Europeans brought with them, like measles and smallpox. Soon, a triangular-shaped trade route was set up between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. This triangle-shaped trade route resulted in the mass exchange of goods between the continents, including slaves. The voyage across the Atlantic for slaves became known as the Middle Passage. Large numbers of Africans faced deplorable conditions on these ships and were packed like sardines. Many Africans died on this Middle Passage journey. Life expectancy for many African slaves was only 35 years of age. The demand for slaves will continue until the 1800s and will result in a mass diaspora of individuals from Africa around the globe. The Portuguese also established a labor system similar to the Spanish in their territories. Landowners called donatários were given big pieces of land on which to establish plantations. These were similar to the encomienda system and also resulted in a demand of African slaves until the 1800s. Mercantilism, plantations, and triangular trade will result in a global exchange of goods and products that eventually became known as the Columbian exchange. This was named after Columbus, naturally. The exchange resulted in many new products and crops being introduced from the New World to Europe and vice versa, and it should be noted that the Old World was Europe, just so you know. But the result of the exchange was also disease. European diseases nearly eradicated all of the Native American populations who had little to no resistance to diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, aka flu. The establishment of colonies and triangular trade will also result in a new social hierarchy or social class system in the Americas, especially in the Spanish colonies. This rigid social structure is often called the peninsular system. Under the peninsular system, the highest class of people were the peninsular class. The peninsulars were the Spanish-born officials who were sent from Spain to govern the colonies. Viceroys and their family were peninsulars, as were high-ranking church officials. Economic, political, and social life was pretty much all dictated by the peninsulars, who looked down on the Spanish citizens who were born in the colonies. American-born colonists were below the peninsulars, and they were called Creoles. Although Creoles technically had the same rights as peninsulars, they never held top government jobs. The next group of people in the peninsular system were the mestizos. These were people of mixed European and Native American ancestry. Mestizos were sometimes slave overseers, shop owners, artisans, or farmers. Below the mestizos were the Native Americans. Native Americans were often sharecroppers on large haciendas and maintained their own cultural traditions, including their own languages, although most converted to Catholicism and spoke Spanish. Below Native Americans were the free blacks, who were often barbers, shoemakers, goldsmiths, sculptors, or musicians. At the bottom of the peninsular system were the slaves. Slaves were purchased from different parts of Africa they were purposely made slaves. And they were unable to communicate with one another because they were purchased on purpose from different parts of Africa so that they couldn't communicate with one another. Slaves were forced to adopt Spanish, and generations of culture and native languages were lost. Slaves were allowed to marry in the Spanish colonies and sometimes were able to buy their freedom from their owners. A unifying force during the colonial age in Latin America was the Catholic Church. Missionaries set up missions on church land and converted people to Christianity. Missionaries often traveled at great risk to remote areas to convert people and build these missions. A great movie that shows this is called The Mission. Watch it, it's great. Catholic missionaries ended up doing a lot to protect the native populations. However, converting people to Catholicism often resulted in generations of people losing their traditional beliefs and practices. The Catholic Church will go on to control much land in Latin America. Its influence is still seen there today in the form of village churches and architecture, as well as city and town names. The Catholic Church helped institute schools with the help of the Jesuit order of priests. Think McQuaid, Jesuit high school, right? The Jesuits were all about spreading educational opportunities. They built many universities throughout Latin America. In Latin America today, most people practice Catholicism. The current Pope, Pope Francis, is from Argentina. Catholicism continues to shape many people's lives throughout the region. In Latin America, the extended family structure took hold. Remember extended families? Yeah. Well, when several generations of family members all live together under one roof, we refer to that as an extended family. Families in Latin America often included servants, slaves, craft workers, and padrinos, or godparents. Padrinos were responsible for the religious instruction of their children. These extended families were always male-dominated or patriarchal in nature. Even today, most families in Latin America are still patriarchal. Towns and cities were built throughout the Spanish and Portuguese empires, modeled after cities and towns in Europe. There was a town church, a large plaza, where people would gather for public events like weddings, meetings, as well as religious festivals. Throughout Latin America today, there is still this type of structure in place in most nations and towns, with old-style Spanish buildings and churches. Most haciendas, or plantations, actually became small towns in and of themselves, similar to the feudal-type manors that existed in Europe during the Middle Ages. Very often, these haciendas had debt-laden workers called peons who could stay and work until their debts were paid off. Latin America also had its fair share of maroon colonies. Maroon colonies were villages and small towns set up by escaped slaves. Sometimes these maroon colonies disappeared when the slaves were recaptured. Eventually, Latin American colonies will demand their independence from Spain and Portugal. Thanks for listening. Bye.